This talk examines underground art and artist collectives during China's Cultural Revolution. Centered on the Wuming no-name painting group active in Beijing from 1973 to 1981, I explore the interconnections between art practice and community formation, and between the artist's individual subjectivity and the group dynamics of their collective. I was one of the group's participants then, the woman in the middle of this photo. Today, I am an anthropologist and historian, and am now studying the history of the art collective in which I participated. I will speak in the first-person voice as a scholar studying that history, and in the third-person voice when referring to paintings and actions that I authored in the past. I'll make 3 points about this case. First, Wuming art is a kind of a private art and an early form of Chinese modernist art. Second, this private art practice helped to create the subjectivity of modern individuals in the face of the Maoist state's drastic erosion of the private and public domains. And finally, the social life of this art collective demonstrates that such private art and modern individuality is produced from solidarity rather than solitude. Together, I argue that both this underground art practice and the Wuming collective were creative interventions against radical revolutionary modernity. Most of Wuming art expresses private experience and private sensations, without stating any overt political message. This private expression can be represented by the painting Lotus, which the group chose for the poster announcing their first public exhibition. It's very different from a dissident art as represented by Wang Keping's famous idol. Whereas idol evokes collective memories of official politics, Lotus represents a solitary individual spirit transcending that politics and evoking a private inner world. The lotus is an emblem of Buddhism and a traditional literati subject, symbolizing the purity of the individual spirit, elevating above the so-called filthy mud. Yet this painting is also modernist, adopting the modernist vision of an individual experiencing light in a fleeting moment. While representing individual and spiritual experience rather than political social reality, such private art is nonetheless inherently political, if we situate it within the structures of meaning and the conditions of art production at that time. Spring, a typical Wuming landscape, illustrates this point. It seems non-political in its form and content, but its relationship to dominant art production was subversive, for it was produced and circulated entirely outside of the official art apparatus. The material for this painting came from the art collective instead of the state sponsorship. The artists shared paint and brushes and helped one another making painting boxes. They prepared their oil painting supports together by brushing boiled bone glue on paper or cardboard. The painting was also painted in the artist's private time outside of work. And the site of Spring was a public park, which the group appropriated and transformed into their own private communal space. The entire production and circulation, therefore, went on outside of official art production and state-controlled institutions, creating other spaces, other subjects, other visual languages and other means of production. Official art doctrine from the time is illustrated by this propaganda poster. It uses socialist realism to represent a female work militia. Above her is another female figure, a main character from a model drama. It serves blatantly as a mode, molding socialist subjects. The title is a command. One must become the person in the painting, who in turn must become the heroine in the drama. Mao's decree that art serves politics was perfected into a set of rigid artistic imperatives. The genre of art must be thematic and figural. The subject must be workers, peasants, and soldiers, and the style must be red, bright, and shiny. Art that did not strictly follow such stylistic dictates were condemned. While official art aimed to mold socialist subjects, underground art transfigured socialist subjects into self-reflective modern individuals. Plowing is one example. The site was a state farm near Sino-Soviet border. The painter Zheng Zigang spent 10 years here, where the youths were organized in military units and shared collective dormitories. This pastoral scene does not represent the actual mechanized agricultural industry or the collective living that artists experienced. In contrast, it asserts individual emotion, energy, and freedom. The vast black soil moves from the bottom upward with such a powerful force that it bends the horizon into a curve, slanting the sky in the direction of its motion. At the center is the source of all motion and energy, a single man driving 2 horses, plowing the land. His body the same color as the black soil, leaving behind him long cuts deep in earth. A lone man in nature, naked of any social signs, with his naked animals, is dancing the primal dance of a man living on land. The perspective is from high and far away, the view of a flying bird, a bird that is the painter and the viewer in one. The expressive brushwork, informal composition, contrasting colors, and personal perspective together celebrate life and freedom. The energy and the joy of the painting assert that the painter had overcome hardship to become a man of his own liking. Both painter and viewer rise as self-determining individuals with their own subjectivity, no more a socialist subject disappearing in the collective. As art, this is a form of Chinese modernism. By modernism, T.J. Clark sees the rise of a distinctive patterning of mental and technical possibilities moving from representation to agency. The painter here was moving away from representing reality to asserting his agency as the creator of the meaning of his own life. If European modernism rebelled against the use of narrative and illustrations for religious propaganda, Wuming art likewise rebelled against the use of socialist realism for political propaganda. Embracing modernist visual languages, Wuming artists asserted their subjective experience. This leads to my second point. Such modernist art and the private individual rebelled against the state's drastic erosion of both the private and the public spheres. China's pathway towards modernity was carried out through continued revolutions, assaulting the private domain as its major obstacle. Mao Zedong stated in 1944 that it is necessary to destroy the peasant family in order to transform the means of production from a family agriculture and handcraft to machines. This was done through mass movements, from land reform to collectivization, with the nationalization of industries and business, accomplishing the similar expropriation of the private in urban China during 1950s. Thought reform further transformed the mind and programmed the emotions of the entire population. The massive sent-down movement during the Cultural Revolution fragmented most of urban families. The individual was stripped of his family shelter as well as intimacy, leaving him naked, standing alone in front of the stage, with his heart and soul exposed for public scrutiny. Melody of Homesickness is a good example of what Hannah Arendt would call the rebellion of the heart against destruction of the family. After living in this house alone for 10 years, when most of urban families were shattered, Zhao Wenliang took his lonely house as a subject. This is a wintry night. The warm yellow glow of the interior contrasting with the house's black silhouette. The warmth of a home is much longed for under the frosty moon. The two shadowy figures are the painter himself and his younger daughter who had come to visit. They seemed spellbound by the scene of a promised home, frozen as if afraid to break a good dream, while the black cat, the animal of night, is about to leap to break the spell. As in Chinese painting, the smooth brushwork spread the oil paint like ink, letting it be absorbed into the paper. And white areas are the paper ground scrupulously left unpainted. An earlier title, Melody of the Moonlight, was taken directly from a famous traditional poem. These features gave the painting a strong Chinese identity, evoking a long collective memory to express a shared longing for home in the hearts of modern Chinese men and women. The shattering of such private homes was an intentional component of modernization under Mao. View from Zhang Wei's home is a view from a window in an apartment building that had been built as a monumental model of the Great Leap Forward of 1958, one of the famed communist mansions. This large apartment block was designed for hundreds of families living together and dining in a communal canteen in the basement, so no individual kitchens were built. The collective utopia envisioned by Mao was postponed due to the resulting famine, but it was realized on a more radical scale in 1968, when the Cultural Revolution took tens of millions of urban individuals out of their homes and sent them down to rural China to start collective living. Inside the home depicted here, 5 of Zhang Wei's 6 siblings were sent to different provinces, living in same-sex dorms and eating in collective kitchens, an experience shared by 17 million youths. The painter of the scene, Zheng Ziyan, also had her family split, with 6 members sending to 5 different provinces. Gazing out the window, traditional courtyard homes in the distance contrast with the bare concrete and rectangular rooms of the communist mansion. But unseen reality of shattered families and broken blood ties was a lived experience of urban families in both kinds of homes. To turn the fragmented individuals into socialized subjects, the state also invade their inner world to weed out private thoughts and sentiments and program their consciousness and emotions. As these two photos show, the Cultural Revolution was a great revolution deep down in the soul, carrying out Mao's instruction that you must struggle against the private and criticize revisionism. Here the word private was an equivalent of selfishness. Everyone was to catch a flash of a private thought and confess in public self-criticism. Never before had human mind and heart gone through such thorough scrutiny. Through such engineering of the soul, the natal ties within family were replaced by class love, class hatred, and class consciousness. Against such state intrusion, Liu Shi's single bed depicts a private space the painter constructed for himself. Liu Shi did not live with his parents as a child. They devoted their lives to revolutionary work and devalued child-rearing as a private affair, so he grew up with his grandparents. When his parents and older siblings were sent down to the countryside, he moved in to this empty parental home in a state ministry compound. He was assigned a job at the age of 16, becoming a problem youth in the eyes of the party leader. He was repeatedly criticized in public for his bourgeois thoughts and was forced to write self-criticisms. His own father, once returned home, reported him to his work unit for a book he was reading in secret. His work unit ordered even more criticisms meetings, while his father grounded him at home to read Chairman Mao's Red Book. It was short after this that Liu Shi painted Single Bed in a corner of his parental home. Taking his own bed as the main subject, he carved out a private space of his own that defies the intrusion of the party leader and the father. The painting strips away realistic and narrative details, making an anti-representational declaration, a powerful assertion of individual subjectivity by asserting the artist's action of manufacture. Rectangular patches of pure paint of contrasting colors are smeared onto the fiberboard with a palette knife, like an angry rebellion or a worker plastering a wall. He was indeed building a wall, enclosing a spiritual inner world that was his only shelter. The black rectangular shapes depicted on the walls are his own paintings, and the white patch on the near side of the bed seemed to be a book, with a ball-like reading lamp above on the right. The personal inner world is thus constructed by art and literature and by the action of painting and reading, actions that defines the subjectivity of the painter's being. This new modern individual was born within the context of radical socialism, negotiating his space within the family, the work unit, and the society. He does not demand absolute rights of self-interest or absolute economic freedom. Instead of an economic man, the individual emerging from this private art is an creative person, shaping his life and building his own meaning through art. Nor does he reject human solidarity. In fact, he depends essentially on a community coming into being only within the solidarity created by the artist collective. This community was what artists created outside of the state-controlled institutions and the family in a third space. This leads to my final point, Wuming as a collective. Art as a social action depends on the public, as does the individual who takes the action. A public realm is a critical condition for the individual to appear. In China's great leap towards modernity, the overarching strength of the party state precluded a public square or civil society. With the public domain missing, underground artist collectives functioned as a substitute, offering the only space in which the artists could reveal their uniqueness to others and thus emerge as distinct modern individuals. The Wuming group as a social formation, therefore, responded to the Maoist state elimination of both the private and public domains. The work unit system was the primary means of state control. By the time the artists met in 1973, all of them were institutional men and women assigned to various work units by the state. The work unit functioned as a cell of the state. It defined the person's identity, issuing the person's only photo ID and granting permission for marriage, childbirth, and travel. It provided life necessities ranging from salary and ration coupons for food to child care, medical care, bathing facilities, and even toilet paper. It also controlled the social mobility and a person's thought, keeping a person's file which recorded the person's family background, political performance and mistakes, thought reports and self-criticisms, and rewards and punishment. One painting takes the interior of a work unit as its subject. Carpenters Workshop by Aihe Wang was painted inside a plastic factory, one of the urban people's communes for labor-intensive industry. The factory functioned as a unit of state housekeeping. The stove occupied the central position for heating and for heating the lunch. The wooden crates stored clothes. Lumbers and carpentry tools are spreading all over the room. Work, eating, clothing, political study, and thought reform all took place in this room. The painter worked 12 years in this factory, spending 8 hours working and often 2 hours in political study each day, 6 days a week. The work unit took and controlled most of the person's waking hours. Outside of the state institutional controls, the artists formed a clandestine collective, cutting across 3 major social boundaries set by the state: political generation, gender, and class. The group was composed of 2 generations, separated by different political experience. The older painters all came from persecuted families of class enemies and shared a low social status. The younger generation came from different classes but shared another common experience. Some other common experiences: the suspension of schools, the Red Guards movement, the sent-down movement. The state tried to segregate generations, and by gathering and painting together, the Wuming group caused suspicion within their families and the neighborhood. The Wuming group also overcome another boundary, the boundary of gender. a historically rooted boundary, reinforced in an ultra-militant and masculinized society in which segregation between men and women were highly guarded both in workplaces and in collective living. Crossing this gender divide, the Wuming group always included a critical mass of women, about 1/3 of the artists. With this exceptional gender diversity, the group created a gendered art in a genderless society, reasserting eradicated femininity and celebrating women's passages of life, as illustrated by this portrait of a girl, Xiaohuan. Most importantly, the group broke the formidable boundary of class. The Wuming artists came from families of all classes segregated by the state. Both high communist cadres and their executed enemies, both proletarian and capitalist, revolutionary and counter-revolutionary, leftist and rightist. By mixing classes, genders, and generations, the group celebrated plurality and diversity, functioning as a substitute for the missing public space within a highly conformative society. Its diversity enabled the group to become a vibrant cultural hub in which the members shared music, books, and art catalogs, debated ideas, and developed distinct personal styles. They organized the collective underground exhibitions and group painting trips. Yang Yushu's After the Calamity evidences the group's social diversity. The central object is an antique vase owned by a female member's family, and a distinctive red floor indicates a dorm room inside the compound of the Ministry of Culture, of the very center of state control over culture. The painter, on the other hand, was one of the aldermen whose father had been executed by the state. The painter and the motif thus came from opposite ends of society. In the same room, painting the same vase and flowers, were sons and daughters of the ruling elites and their most hated enemies from 2 generations. The painting of this vase was also a social action, showing how a collective of diversity enabled an individual identity to emerge. Multiple artists painted the same arrangement that day, and then hung their paintings up to dry. This one emerged as a masterpiece through collective recognition. Its meaning was interpreted and reinterpreted by multiple group members, and its title developed from the discussion. It was called After the Calamity. The vase, having survived house raids, was taken as a symbol of a traditional culture surviving the Cultural Revolution, while the peach blossoms, though surviving the winter, were so ravaged that there were few buds left to bloom in the spring. Here, the rise of a unique artist with a distinct style was completed by the presence of others, the function of a public space. In Mao's society, the entire population was supposed to follow a single perspective and a single mind, Mao Zedong thought. The artist collective, with its solidarity and diversity, nurtured individual uniqueness and creativity. In this sense, both the artist as agent and art as action relied on this proto-public. The artists were self-conscious about the sense of self emerging from the collective. Du Xia's Lotus was painted in the summer of 1976, after the bloody crackdown of the First Tiananmen movement and the devastating earthquake. But in this painting, you do not see that world of state affairs, only an alternative common world of the Wuming group. The site was a public park where all members painted, and the willows and lotus were shared subjects. Central to this landscape is the figure in the middle. This is not an imagined figure, but another painter painting together. The scene is about tranquility in the midst of chaos and about being absorbed in nature. By taking a step back and showing another painter absorbed in a landscape, absorption becomes theme. The landscape becomes a communal space in which the painter, reflecting on another painter and in the presence of others, emerges with her distinct identity. To conclude, it is a solidarity rather than solitude that nurtured this private art and the modern individual. Wuming artists formed their own alternative collective outside of state institutions and art production. As a novel social formation, they were not just players of the game designed by the state, but also starting some of their own games. Such underground artists' collective served as a substitute for the shattered private and public domains, and as incubators for the rising modern individual and alternative subjectivity. As art, this early form of Chinese modernism created a contrasting vision against official art. Official art projected onto billboards the spectacles of revolutionary modernity, while underground art projected onto A4 paper its antithesis. A modernity imagined otherwise, transcending social control and transforming state-imposed visual modes. Underground art hence gave birth to an alternative Chinese modernism, an alternative imagination of modernity, and alternative subjectivity that transfigured socialist subjects into self-reflective modern individuality. As a history, the Wuming art and the collective demonstrate that human agency could assert itself even under extreme conditions, and the novel social forms of solidarity could appear against the conditions of conformity and atomization. Private art as an aesthetic project and the Wuming group as a social formation were both creative interventions against revolutionary modernity, asserting human agency and human solidarity at a time when both were under great threat. Thank you.